this is, you'll recognize a world map. And the reason I have this map up is it shows all of the countries in the world where private health insurance is illegal. And you can see out of 100, well, people argue whether there are 195 or 197 countries. There is only one in which healthcare insurance is outlawed, and we're there. So most people wouldn't think of Malcolm Gladwell as a right of center thinker, but here is his view on Canada's health system. He thinks it's the worst thing, and you know, once you go outside of the country and realize there are other health systems, you start to figure that out. I will briefly, before I get to the court case, and talk about how we got there. And of course, our health system was founded partly on the British and partly on the New Zealand health systems, and neither of which ever saw themselves outlawing the option and the choice that patients should have. And this was Sir William Beveridge, who was the founder of the British National Health Service. And although you may not realize it, Tommy Douglas felt likewise, that he never intended to outlaw private health insurance. And in fact, the Canada Health Act does not outlaw private health insurance. What's interesting is to look at what left-wing politicians around the world have thought. And this was a former Labour left-wing New Zealand politician called Aubrey Begg, who said, he made the remark, free marketing and deregulation are not right-wing policy stances. They're the policies of those who believe in individual liberty and choice. And we'll see, pointing out the similarities between extreme right and extreme left, with Hitler and Stalin being pretty similar in many ways. In other words, extremism is a problem. And I'll just point out that private healthcare, John Robson earlier talked about North Korea and Cuba. Actually, it's private insurance, health insurance and private healthcare are legal in North Korea and Cuba. I happen to know, I'm an honorary member. You'll see me I put that slide up to show my socialist tendencies with Fidel Castro, and private health insurance and private healthcare is alive and well in Cuba. They actually engage in the business of medical tourism, generating income to support their own public health system in the same way that that other countries do, and in the same way that Canada does not. Again, to pour cold water on those who think this is that Canada's health system is a socialist only system, and that socialist countries don't like it. You'll see this quote from the head of the milk company in Vietnam, supporting privatization as making companies more efficient. And even Gorbachev supported freedom of choice, which is not something that that we have in Canada when it comes to healthcare. I'll just quickly go through the story. 2 years ago, I was invited to go and speak at a conference in Budapest. And the reason I was invited to speak was because I had, this was an international health group who could not believe that Canada outlawed private healthcare and private health insurance. So I was asked to speak at this conference, and there were representatives from pretty well every country on earth. After my talk, I was approached by 5 delegates from Beijing, China. And they were close to the government in China. And they said no Chinese government would dare to do what the Canadian government has done. So it puts things in perspective, I think. How did we get into this mess? Well, the Saskatchewan Medicare Act of 1961 evolved after after the post-war area, and yes, Tommy Douglas was partly responsible for this. In fact, he wasn't the prime Saskatchewan person involved, but that's another story. But the Saskatchewan Medicare Insurance Act had 8 principles, and you see them here. And what's interesting is the first 5 of what were taken and formulated by into the Canada Health Act, the 5 principles. But notice they left out the last 3: effective, efficient, and responsible. And maybe that's what went wrong. So we have a system today, and our clinic treats patients from all over the world. We treat athletes from, I treat athletes from Europe, from professional soccer teams, and from from hockey teams and professional sports teams in North America. They are somehow overlooked by the establishment, and as are many other groups. The other thing that's shocking to me is that we live in a democracy, and just over 2 years ago, Ipsos, one of the biggest polling companies in Canada, polled Canadians on what they thought of our lawsuit, and specifically our constitutional challenge. And 76% across the country, in Alberta it was 80%, in BC it was 80%, were in support of our case. And yet the governments, both federal and provincial, were in court fighting against the thoughts of 80% of the public. What kind of system do we have? Well, others will talk about this, but this was the World Health Organization ranking, where we were 30th in the world, but we're up there in the top 3 in spending. The Canadian Institute for Health Information, which is a federally funded group, together with the Commonwealth Fund, have come up with studies every year or 2, and Canada performs poorly compared to other developed countries. And yes, we're probably better than Afghanistan, and Madagascar, but we're down there when it comes to developed countries. Most interestingly, we are poor in caring for low-income Canadians. We are poor and at the bottom of the heap when it comes to equity. And we also have a problem with access to drugs and dental care, especially among young people. The hospital bed crisis has had an influence, of course, and Canada has 2 distinctions when it comes to hospital beds. One is that we have the most inefficient hospitals in the developed world, as you see from this slide. We're spending more than twice what the average OECD is per hospital discharge. But interestingly, the latest figures show we've dropped to 51st in the world in the number of beds per population. And of course, this is part of the reason that the COVID crisis has been so difficult for Canada. One of the architects, one of the recent commissions, well-known commissions, was Roy Romano. And as you all are aware, he was the commissioner in 2002 that came out with the Romano report that was going to cure the maladies of our health system. Roy Romano, when he was the premier of Saskatchewan, closed 52 hospitals. That was his qualification for being appointed a federal commissioner. Our hospitals, some of our hospitals carry out their own audits, and they're doing very badly when it comes to benchmarks and what they're supposed to do. Less than 50% achieving their benchmark in BC's biggest hospital. So why is this? Well, why are we so inefficient? Why are we 3rd in cost? And and yet at the bottom in quality and access. Well, one of the reasons is our massive bureaucracy. We have 11 times as many public health administrators in Canada as they do in Germany, for example. And yet they have no wait lists in Germany, or at least, I mean, I'm talking pre-COVID now because COVID has had an impact on wait lists all over the world, but the biggest impact has been in Canada, but you won't hear about it because the government won't reveal the data. We also, we have 14 ministries of health, whereas a country like France has one ministry of health, and yet it has double the population. The other thing, there's a big myth out there. You will hear governments announce that we only spend between 1% and 3% on administrative costs. Well, when you file freedom of information actions like Dr. Barry Turchin did in 2008, you will find that actually our administrative costs are 15 to 16%. And this is due to deliberate deception on the part of our governments and hospital authorities and provincial governments in hiding the true data. But the Freedom of Information study that was done by the Canadian Medical Association, presented at the Canadian Medical Association in 2008 by Dr. Turchin, revealed there were actually double US Medicare and US Medicaid, which are public systems within the US. So this is Air Corail. I'm sure none of you have ever flown it. It's the North Korean airline. It's the worst performing airline in the world by the whatever airline associations rate airlines. And as you can see, these are the criteria it operates under. It extracts the funds, dictates the spending, sets the price, owns and controls all the facilities and locations, trains, employs, regulates, and funds the workers, governs how, where, and when the clients are served, determines the level and quality of services, and it self-regulates and self-evaluates. These are the same criteria that Canada's health systems operate under. I put this quote in because this conference is originating in Alberta, and I thought it was interesting to see this quote from an administrator at a Calgary health region some years ago that was quoted in the Calgary Herald, that Calgary Health Administration argues that accurate cost accounting would require a diversion of effort better spent elsewhere. And there are reasons for this. It relates partly to our unusual global funding, where we give hospitals their money up front and there's no requirement for performance. We are unusual. The other interesting thing is Canadians leave in massive numbers, or at least they did pre-COVID when they were allowed to get healthcare elsewhere. And they mostly leave for the US, but they go to India, to the Caribbean, and to Europe. It took me back to many years ago when Thea Vakil, who was the Associate Deputy Minister of Health in British Columbia, I asked her at an open conference about private MRIs, and I have no connection to any private MRI, but I said, we found out that 2/3 of the clients at the Bellingham MRI Center just south of British Columbia in Washington, US, 2/3 of the clients were Canadians and from BC. And I said, wouldn't it be better to keep them here rather than having them cross the border to get MRIs? And her response in an open meeting was, if she could stop them going at the border, she would. And that is an attitude of arrogance and control that Canadian governments feel they should have over Canadians. I just put this in as a quick example before I get to the actual court case. This is actually the daughter of a cardiologist from British Columbia, and this is a hospital back east. And she was sent to get a Holter monitor by her family doctor because she had a an arrhythmia. And she was in her 30s. And the requisition was sent in March. She got a note back in June from the hospital, a computer-generated letter saying, I'm sorry, we're giving you an appointment in June. If the person named on this computer-generated letter is deceased, please accept our sincere apologies. This is a public hospital responding to a patient. So in our court case, we discussed a lot of factors that are happening in Canada, and literally patients are suffering and dying on wait lists. That's not my conclusion. That was the conclusion of the Supreme Court of Canada. It's also evidenced in reports and documents that are in the newspapers daily. A few years ago, some years ago, it's 2007, but if they did it today, it would be the same. Doctors were polled by our national newspaper, it's called the Medical Post. 26% of family doctors had a patient die on a wait list. The Fraser Health region, which is one of the biggest health regions in BC, and this was evidence in our trial, 308 patients died on the wait list in 1 year. Extrapolated to Canada, that represents 6,100 a year are dying on wait lists. And again, this was pre-COVID, when the wait lists were considerably less than they are now. So in 2005, the Supreme Court of Canada came out with the Quebec decision. And this is not a right-wing court, as you know. This is the same court, the Supreme Court of Canada, legalized same-sex marriage, legalized abortion, legalized assisted dying, legalized a lot of things. It's hardly a right-wing court, but they ruled that the evidence shows that patients are suffering and dying on public healthcare wait lists, and that they have a right to rise above political debate. And I found myself, fortunately, wearing a mask on the front page of the Globe and Mail that day, because it became obviously one of the biggest stories in the country. So this was a ruling of the Supreme Court of Canada. They ruled it violated the constitutional rights of life, liberty, and security of person. They stated that it was acting as a de facto monopoly, that it caused, the health system was causing physical and psychological suffering and imposed a risk of death and harm. So getting now to moving to more recent times, we then opened our own, we had opened our Canby Surgery Center sometime before that, with the support of the NDP government of the day, and with the support of the trade unions. But it's interesting that as things have evolved, that new concepts are being created. And I've just put this up as an aside. It's interesting because First Nations, the Indigenous peoples of Canada, who do not accept the descriptions that Canadian healthcare is a defining feature of their nationhood, they are planning big time to create private healthcare, private hospitals, and even a private medical school and the first Canadian private medical school is likely to be in British Columbia. And there are 57 or so private medical schools in the United States. Canada has none. Those United States medical schools include schools like Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Columbia. These are hardly second-rate medical schools, and Canada has none. Every country has them, except every developed country has them, except ours. So getting now back to our case, we obviously knew from Chowley that there was public support in Chowley. Ipsos did a poll after the Chowley decision. 83% of doctors supported the Chowley decision of the Supreme Court of Canada. 81% of physicians thought it will reduce wait lists, and a significant majority of the public did. And of course, as I said, now that has translated to the public in British Columbia, it hasn't translated into the government, however. We now have a health system, literally, and we have literally a health system in which pets have access to health insurance and private healthcare that are denied to citizens, that federal prisoners, judges, federal employees, federal police officers, federal armed forces all have access to private healthcare that is denied to the general public, and of course injured workers too. So this is a cartoon on British Columbia, a phone call from the British Columbia Premier to the President of the United States, thanking him for solving their health system because all of their doctors, nurses, and patients are now down in the United States. I'm not going to talk about COVID because we just heard a long talk on it, but I will tell you that COVID has made things much, much worse, and the government is not sharing the data with you, with us. That this was a study from McMaster by actually a group that oppose, if you like, private options in healthcare. But they have predicted that COVID will increase wait times in Canada by 7 times. This was a 2020 study. They repeated the study a year later and think they've underestimated what that study will be, what that number will be. So, and this was, I mean, we know there is a massive pent-up demand now in healthcare. Right now, hospitals across the country are devastated. So-called elective, which we don't agree with the term, scheduled surgeries. By scheduled surgeries, we include cancer surgeries and heart surgeries, are being cancelled and not scheduled. We alluded to, this has been alluded to earlier, but some people consider themselves exempt from the rules, and this is just the thin edge of the wedge, if you like, of politicians and leaders, one union leader who have accessed private healthcare for themselves, even though they have stood on soapboxes saying it should not be allowed. And we can talk about that later if anyone's interested. I debated this fellow, and health minister of Quebec a few years ago. He stepped down now as the health minister. But this statement shows you the arrogance with which politicians treat the health system and treat hospitals and doctors. Hospitals have fixed budgets, and you must not run over them. You can't just keep accepting patients and treating them once the money's run out. It won't be tolerated. So this is the Canadian health system at its best. I debated with Mr. Barrett in Montreal about 3 or 4 years ago. And of course, he was in support of the public only system. I was in support of choice and of a hybrid system that exists in any other developed country. At the end of the debate, he came up to me and he patted me on the back and said, "You know, Brian, I know I've debated on this side, but I can tell you every health minister in the country wants you to win your lawsuit." But that's what we're facing. So we began our constitutional trial in January of 2009. And the government went out of its way to try and block the process, to slow the process down. And it was, the whole process was aimed at making us go away, at bankrupting us. We have had a lot of support, financial support, that we alone we're a small facility, relatively speaking. But we had a lot of support, and we've dogged it out, and finally got to court in 2016, after multiple blocks were attempted by the government. And honestly, I think Mr. Bumble, by the way, Mr. Bumble wasn't very good at English, but he probably was right when, and many lawyers consider the law has a lot of problems right now in Canada, and especially constitutional law, and especially the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You need millions of dollars to fight for your rights in this country. So there's almost no point in having a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. No individual whose rights are being impacted by government can afford to take on the government unless they have access to funding. And fortunately, we were given that access. Our lawsuit was commenced in response to, we were operating between June 1996 and 2009. Our clinic was operating with the quiet but relatively unspoken support of government, and but we were forced to file this constitutional challenge by the BC Nurses Union, because we knew we were in violation of the law, but the BC provincial laws, but we felt, and always did feel, and we had constitutional support for that belief from Canada's leading constitutional lawyers. We thought the law was unlawful. We thought it was like some of the other laws that have been struck down. And what this, the reason for this check is again, you could call it cognitive dissonance or hypocrisy, but the BC Nurses Union, which launched this action against, forced the government to then to enact an act on the law that was on the books but not being acted upon by the government. The BC Nurses Union went to court to force them to act on the law. This is just to show you the BC Nurses Union has sends us patients, and that's the cognitive dissonance. We began our lawsuit in court in September of 2016, and it went into a fourth year. Again, ridiculous blocks and attempts to block us by the lawyers in the BC, acting for the BC government. This was me and Marvin Starrow, who is a retired lawyer, a very well-known lawyer in Canada. So what we were basically seeking, I had tried the political route. I had talked to politicians. I had the support of politicians, but as was alluded to earlier by John Robson, what happens when politicians have the power, they don't act on it. And I remember once being on a podium in Ottawa with Ralph Klein and Mike Harris, and they were both ex-premiers by this time, and they were obviously standing there, and they supported private options. I was asked to speak, and it was an armchair thing, and I said, well, I looked at Harris and Klein and I said, you were both there with big majorities. You had the power and you didn't do anything. I went and became, I stood for and was elected president of the Canadian Medical Association in 2007-8, and I thought that was a way to try and influence politicians even more, but it didn't happen, and that's why we eventually had to resort to the courts, hoping the courts will help us. I'll quickly tell you this anecdote because it's interesting. We launched this lawsuit And the main defendants in the case were the attorney generals of British Columbia. And these are 6 of the attorney generals. Just after we launched the case, 2 weeks after, and I know all of these people, I was phoned by one of them, and I thought, the incumbent actually, and I thought he was mad at me for, because we were basically suing him. And no, he was on the phone saying, "Oh, hi, Brian. I wonder if you can help me out. A friend of mine's got a really bad knee and wants to get seen, and he wants to go private." So this was the defendant in the case calling me. One of the other, I won't go through them, but one of the pictures you see here of a defendant in the attorney general later became one of our lawyers. Another one was when they were in law practice, sent us clients from Singapore who wanted to build a private hospital in BC. Another accessed private healthcare themselves at a different clinic because they were they were in need of back surgery and a strike happened. Another one paid $250 to sit at my table when I gave to a speech at the Vancouver Board of Trade. And then the bottom one was a friend of mine, Margaret, was also against me in the trial as a defendant. So this is what you face in the law. So we fought this case, and we proved actually in court a violation we did prove that that patients were suffering, and that was accepted, and I'll just show you some data on that soon. But the judge eventually was able to, and we can talk about the judge in a minute, there's a let out even if you have patients being harmed, and he ruled against us. The court hearing was very interesting. At times, our lawyers were outnumbered in the courtroom by lawyers in a ratio of 16-1, mostly 11-1 or less, but still. This was the way the court, the BC government launched their approach. They attacked the doctors. Pain or suffering from waiting for medical care is caused by decisions of treating physicians. Physicians and specialists fail to promptly make referrals, causing further delays. Family physicians are expected to ensure they receive appropriate care. Surgeons manage their own wait lists. It's not respectful for surgeons to blame the government. And of course, I'm not being respectful today. This was some other points they made. The harms caused by the current, they literally said this in evidence. The harms caused by the current legislation are not relevant. Not all relevant evidence should be admitted to court. Well, while it's possible to argue that individual physicians' testimony has a logical connection, in my submission, the cost of allowing that into evidence is not beneficial. They argue that the evidence is admissible as long as it can be traced to a reliable source. They offer no authorities in support of that argument. These are quotes from the lawyers. Comments from a government minister or premier cannot constitute admissions that can be relied upon. These are just a few brief summaries of the BC government itself. We went to great lengths to have to get this from the government because they refused to release it voluntarily. But patients with cancers, these are the maximum numbers who were treated within the maximum acceptable, medically acceptable time. And you can see people with bladder cancer, 16% treated within the maximum time. Cancer of the ovary, 22%. These are terrible figures of performance for the government's own benchmarks. Worse, perhaps worse still, children with health problems, less than 50% being treated within the time they should. During the trial, we actually had to get an injunction because the government wanted to introduce fines of $10,000 to $20,000 for any doctor who treated a patient. We got an injunction. These are some of the statements that the injunction judge made, basically siding with us that, yeah, we need an injunction because people are going to suffer. That we'd made us we'd established irreparable harm in the context of a constitutional case, and the government then tried to go to the appeal court of BC, and they sided with that injunction judge. Now, this was a different judge from the trial judge. Also, during the trial, the BC insurance company, which is owned by the government and operates under the defendant, which is the Attorney General of BC, introduced the ability to access private healthcare for car accidents, just like they could for workers. And of course, as I said, prisoners are exempted. We've treated prisoners at our clinic because one of the things I've said is, our case is about fighting for the rights of people who are not in jail to have the same rights as Canadians who are in jail. These are some of the quotes from the judge. Patients must wait for the treatment they choose to receive, but that's irrelevant to their liberty. This is the trial judge. Patients improve 8% per month. These are findings of fact by the judge. In fact, the evidence was they get worse by 8% per month after 6 months. But the judge made these errors in his final judgment against us. Cambie's nurses bill the government. What he had found, the judge had looked into documents and found that that there were female doctors at Cambie who, in their other practice, not at Cambie, billed the government, which he had assumed that because they were females, they were nurses. That we give an 80% discount to BC patients. What the evidence was a 20% discount compared to foreigners from far off countries because of the administrative load. He reviewed the totality of the evidence and found that there's no evidence that more than 60,000 patients are removed from waitlists each year in BC. The evidence in court was that 69,000 were removed. He just didn't see it. He said that the Workers' Compensation Board was not a private insurer. One of the directors of the Workers' Compensation Board gave evidence in the courtroom that it was a private insurance company. The judge ignored it. The judge ruled that the introduction of private healthcare will harm the public system and said there's evidence of that. There is no evidence of that because every system in the world has always had a private system and the public systems have been added to it, not the other way around. The judge did not understand the case at all. So here we are. We've had this the Carter case where it was determined that patients who are dying and have a constitutional right to die without pain and suffering. What we were arguing was that the court should not rule, but it did. The court basically ruled that you shouldn't have a right to live without pain and suffering. We went through this court case, which went into a 4th year, and basically our questions that we were asking were simple. The judge in my opinion, was an ideologue who had decided the case from day one. We were basically asking the question, should BC residents have the same rights under the charter that the Supreme Court of Canada gave to Quebecers? And right now, we are pending the BC Appeal Court hearing that happened before 3 judges in June of this year, where we expect a decision of that appeal court before the end of the year. We're hoping for a positive result. Whatever happens, it will go on to the Supreme Court of Canada. It will be binding on every province outside of Quebec. And this is basically where we're at. We're asking for logic versus law. These t-shirts were actually made for us by a supporter, the government does not own my body. But these are the 6 questions. Should a Canadian suffering on a wait list have the same protection under the Charter that the Supreme Court of Canada gave to Quebecers? Can a government promise timely healthcare, fail to deliver it, and then outlaw your ability to care for yourself? Should Canada be the only country on earth where private health insurance is illegal for residents, but legal for non-residents, legal for prisoners, judges, and pets? Who owns your body? An individual, yourself, or the state? And why is it legal in Canada to insure yourself against death? We call it life insurance, but not against illness or injury that may lead to death. And can the status quo be justified based on equity when the studies, including Canadian studies and including the international studies, place us at the bottom of developed countries when it comes to equity? Thank you.